Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Ethereum, Dubious speculation. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Throughout this video, we're going to talk a lot about various ways that you can look at the price of Ethereum. We're really going to focus on ETH USD, but also ETH Bitcoin, as I do think it is very relevant to value assets on their Bitcoin pairs because it helps inform you if they're doing well against a lower risk asset or not. Okay, and if you're new to this channel, I've been of the opinion for about 2 years now that the ETH Bitcoin valuation is in a bear market. And again, I think it's one of those things where it certainly wasn't popular during the merge, but it has fallen a lot ever since. And so what I would like to do is spend some time talking about that, talking about what it would take to actually turn the ETH Bitcoin train around. While I know a lot of people watching this video may assume that I am a Bitcoin maxi, that's not true. Okay, and you'll find out that it's not true here in a few months if we go back to looser monetary policy. But for me, what I have said for years now is that a Bitcoin heavy portfolio over an altcoin heavy portfolio is likely going to do very well. Now, out of the top 20 altcoins, Bitcoin has done better than most of them. There are some smaller market cap coins that have been created recently that have done better, and I'm not trying to talk about that. I'm not dismissing that. I'm just, when I talk about dominance trends and I talk about the cryptoverse, I'm really only talking about the top coins. I don't have an opinion on, whatever the 9,000th altcoin is. Okay, I just don't. So what I really want to focus on is the patterns that we have previously observed, to sort of check in to see if those patterns are continuing, what it would take for that pattern to continue, what would it take for ETH Bitcoin to turn around, and so on and so forth. Okay? Now, first, we must understand that my understanding of the cryptoverse is very dependent on monetary policy and it's very dependent on Bitcoin valuations. If you do not care about Bitcoin valuations, then you will not care to hear what I have to say, because that is what I sort of value my portfolio on. If you only care about the USD valuation, it's completely different. But when I buy something, I want to be very confident that if it's a riskier asset, that it has a good chance to outperform a lower risk asset. Because if it does not, what justification then do I have for holding it? Now, you're probably familiar with all of the narratives by ETH that have been circulating on ETH since the merge. Deflationary aspects, tokenomics, all that stuff, the supply is being burned. And that's why it was given as a reason for why the ETH Bitcoin valuation would do quite well. But narratives are one thing. What actually happens is another. And despite all of the narratives, ETH Bitcoin is down about 41% since the merge. That is a fact, right? It's a fact. Now, ETH USD is up a lot more than I thought it would be at this point. Again, that's also a fact, right? And I'm not going to skirt around the facts. It is up more than I thought it would be. But ETH Bitcoin has followed the general track that I thought it would follow. And I want to talk about, some of the things like how it's similar to last cycle, how it's different than last cycle, and just try to really, really take inventory of that. One of the things that I think has been helpful for me for Ethereum is just sort of a recognition that it bleeds back to Bitcoin while we go into tighter and tighter monetary policy. It bottoms out theoretically when QT is over, and then it starts an uptrend when QE returns. And so that is what I experienced last cycle, and my hope was to help people maximize their risk-adjusted returns, focus on Bitcoin during the QT phase of the cycle, and then maybe pivot some of that over to riskier assets once QE returns. So at this point, ETH Bitcoin is now down 5 quarters in a row. Okay, 5 quarters in a row. Now, I've been dealing with sort of a lot of people saying, what if you're wrong about ETH Bitcoin? And again, it's sort of like, at what point, how many quarters have to go by? How many quarters have to go by? But what I would say is there is a decent chance that ETH Bitcoin bottoms out within a few months. Okay, and I want to explain why. First of all, it's already been 5 quarters, right? I mean, it's not like it hasn't been in a bear market. It's been in a bear market for over a year now. So that is something, right? It is something to say, like, at some point it could theoretically turn around. The problem is that you do run the risk of trying to catch a falling knife. My opinion is that ETH Bitcoin will break support. I want to be clear. I do think it will break support. I could be wrong. I'm happy to go ahead and state that. I could be wrong about that. I do think it will break support. One of the things about, sort of this cycle compared to last cycle is you look at last cycle, the first low that was set, kind of like this low, that was set in December of 2017. So it was actually set at the peak for Bitcoin. This low was set about 3 quarters later. It kind of goes with this narrative of a lot of things happening 3 quarters after where they previously occurred. Okay? What you'll notice, though, is when it came back down to sort of hit this trend line, it occurred at the end of the bear market. Here, when it came back down to tag the trend line, it occurred in January of 2024. So Bitcoin USD is at a different spot than where it was last cycle, but it is still, ETH Bitcoin is still bouncing off of this support level in the same way. Now, what caused ETH Bitcoin to finally break support last cycle and bottom out? What was it? It was rate cuts. It happened around rate cuts. Now, guys, there's all sorts of narratives going around right now about, and I feel very conflicted about it because, and I'm just being honest, right? On one hand, you have all the Bitcoin maxis saying that, that proof of stake will fail. And hey, they could be right. I don't think they are, but they could be right. You have them saying that, it's destined to fail, or, it's destined to just go down forever. And that, this whole transition has been a failure because of the Bitcoin valuation. And so they point to lower valuations. And I agree with them that lower valuations are likely coming for ETH Bitcoin. And I've been very clear that I think it's going to go to 0.03 to 0.04. That is my view. I think that it bottoms out between 0.03 to 0.04. That is where I think ETH Bitcoin is going to go. But where I would disagree with, people that are just sort of full on maxis is that it can bounce from there and get a durable bounce. Now, it doesn't have to necessarily lead to new cycle highs for ETH Bitcoin. I don't know if it's going to take out this high or not. But I would say that regardless of what happens a year and a half from now, let's say Q4 2025, whatever happens, I do think that the sort of the true value proposition of Ethereum against, has not really been fully tested yet, because this is an artifact of monetary policy, right? And Ethereum just being fundamentally higher risk than Bitcoin. That's all it is. It's all it is. And so while there's a lot of narratives circulating right now about, ETH Bitcoin and a lot of people just keep calling the bottom like they have been for the last 2 years, and then other people say it's going to zero. I've been very bearish on it for a long time. You guys know that. But I will say this. And I've learned this myself on a couple of occasions. Okay? If and when it breaks support, right? I'm assuming that it will, but I could be wrong. So let's suppose that I'm right for a minute. I know it might be hard to believe, but let's suppose that I'm right and it breaks support. What I would say is you have 2 months, maybe 3, to find the low. 2 to 3 months. That is my guess, because that's how long it took over here, and that's how long it took right here. About 2 to 3 months to find the low once it broke support. So I don't know when it's going to break support. I have suggested that it could happen in April, right? It could happen in March. I mean, there's only a few days left in March. It's possible. But in order to durably break support, you need a weekly close below the range low at 0.049. And you'd like to see another weekly candle open and close below that level as well. So I don't really think you can have confirmation of it occurring until April anyways. So I would say that it's possible that it breaks down in April, which coincidentally is when the Bitcoin halving is. And I know there's the whole spot ETF narrative for Ethereum, but that's still not out until May, and the halving comes first. So we'll see if ETH Bitcoin can break down here. But I want to be very clear now. If it breaks down, I think it would bottom about 2 to 3 months later. 2 to 3 months. So if it breaks down in April, then potentially it bottoms in June or July. If it breaks down in May, then it might bottom in July or August, right? And so on and so forth, right? If it breaks down in June, then it could be August or September, right? It really just sort of runs a 2 to 3 month period after it breaks. And so I do think it's going to happen. I really do think it's going to break down. And what you'll see very clearly is that when it broke down last cycle, right? When it broke down last cycle, you will see that it actually bottomed when we went from QT to QE. That is precisely where ETH Bitcoin bottomed, okay? Right there. QT to QE. ETH Bitcoin bottomed about 2 months after it broke down. The Fed has already started to talk about potentially slowing this. They didn't say stop, but they said slowing. But once you get into the discussions of slowing it, it leads to the progression of stopping it at some point, right? And the labor market is starting to show some weakness, right? We're at a 3.9% unemployment rate. And so there is a decent chance, especially as we get closer to elections, that they're going to want to stop the pace of QT and maybe level it out, maybe go back to QE. We will see. But I think this is what's coming for Ethereum on its Bitcoin pair. So look, a lot of people have fought this trend the entire way, and I don't know what to say. I mean, I've made a lot of videos on it. Every time I make a video, sometime later it bounces, and then it sort of drags a lot of people back in. They say all sorts of things about me, and then a few months later, you kind of you look back and you're like, oh, it was just another lower high, So it's a trap that a lot of people have fallen into. But I really do think it's about to break down here within the next month or two. So one of the patterns we looked at in this video over here, we did a video on Ethereum about a month ago when it was at 2,800, and we looked at this ascending wedge, okay? And we circled it right here. Now, and we talked about how it was following this ascending wedge where it came back down to where it met, right? But first, it had an explosive move to the upside, right? Now, let's check in with that and see where we are, okay? So, first of all, I want you to look closely at what happened over here with ETHUSD. Do you see this ascending wedge? And do you see how ETHUSD came back through that wedge in August? In August. Why is that important? Well, if you overlay ETH Bitcoin onto this chart, you will find that it bottomed in September, right? It bottomed right after it fell back through the wedge. And again, we know that ETHUSD topped 1 month before rate cuts. So we're potentially getting rate cuts in June. It could be May, but the market is certainly not expecting that right now. Those probabilities could change for May depending on where the labor market comes in next week. But if, whether you get a rate cut in June or May, who really cares? The general trend here, to me, looks very familiar. It looks incredibly familiar, in fact. So look at this move that ETH USD had. It broke out of the wedge. And then it had a pullback, and then it had another large move up, and then it came collapsing back down through the wedge. Do you see that? And that collapse occurred as rate cuts arrived. We know that, right? It occurred as rate cuts arrived. The market came back down to earth as those rate cuts came in. ETH USD fell back through the wedge. Now look at ETH USD over here. It's the same thing, basically. If you can connect these dots right here, we sort of had a little bit, and we even tested right there. We had a little bit of a fake out right there. But you can kind of see something very, very similar. Let me draw this as accurately as I can. And sort of connecting the dots all the way up. You can see a very similar wedge, but it's much bigger than the last one, right? Clearly, it's a lot bigger. But also, what is bigger is the rate hiking cycle, right? This is the artifact of a less impressive rate hiking cycle. This is the artifact of this rate hiking cycle. So it's kind of all the same to some degree, right? To a large degree, it is very much the same. And what you'll see is that it ultimately topped out before rate cuts arrived, and then it fell back through the wedge as those rate cuts arrived. So this wedge comes to a sort of a point here in, June or July, right? It depends on really how you draw it, but around June or July, which is relevant considering that this one fell through it when rate cuts arrived, and the first rate cut is being projected to potentially be June. And look at that. That is potentially right where it's going to fall through the wedge, June or July. You see that? That doesn't mean it can't go up in the short term, right? I'm not trying to say that. We do have the halving next month. Bitcoin still needs to break ETH down on its Bitcoin pair. Remember, what marked the top for Ethereum last cycle during the tail end of the rate hiking cycle and pause was the breakdown of ETH Bitcoin. And that hasn't happened yet, right? So if you go look let's just go look at ETH Bitcoin over here. This right here, that's what ultimately marked the top for ETH USD. If we overlay ETH USD onto this chart, do you see right here? That's where ETH Bitcoin broke down, and that's where ETH USD topped. ETH USD tops when ETH Bitcoin breaks down. Okay? So what if we're looking at the same thing, right? ETH USD tops somewhere over here when ETH Bitcoin breaks down. A weekly close below 0.049, right? A weekly close below 0.049, it still hasn't happened yet. But we are getting really, really close. And in fact, you might be tempted to look at this move here and say, did we just get this penultimate move followed by the final move potentially in April? Again, I don't know. I think there's evidence to support both views. There's evidence to say that Bitcoin could rally into April because it still hasn't broken alt Bitcoin pairs off support. If you were to look at alt Bitcoin pairs, we know that last cycle they broke down 41 weeks after they set the range low. Now look closely at this. 41 weeks after alt Bitcoin pairs set this low here was precisely June 24th when Bitcoin topped. And now look at alt Bitcoin pairs over here. 41 weeks after this range low was set would put you the week of mid-April, right? I don't know exactly. Let me get this an exact sort of match here, just so I make sure I'm telling you guys 41 weeks. So 41 weeks, the week of April 8th, give or take a week or so, right? But again, that's right before the halving, right? It's right before the halving, which is why I'm suggesting that what if the same thing is playing out once again, where ETH is being it's being lifted up on its USD pair, not because of anything fundamental that it's doing differently or better than Bitcoin at this stage because of tighter monetary policy, but it's just going up because Bitcoin's going up. It is not going up on its own, in my opinion. If it were, you would not have 5 quarters in a row where it's red. if you're an ETH maxi and you have hated this view for the last 5 quarters, I'm sorry to say you would have been better off holding Bitcoin. I mean, that might be a tough pill to swallow, but it's the facts, right? I mean, you would have been better off with Bitcoin over the last 5 quarters. And I made so many videos about this back when ETH Bitcoin was, going into the merge. I said, this is a secondary distribution phase, just like Bitcoin USD had a secondary distribution phase in 2021. It seems like everything's being pushed back about 9-10 months. And so in the same way that ETH Bitcoin broke down over here in June 2019, you go fast forward 3 quarters later, and then you add a cycle to it, you basically get April of 2024 for it to potentially break down. And then if it does break down, I'm suggesting that it could bottom out in June or July. And if it does bottom out in June or July on its Bitcoin pair, and it follows what it did last cycle, then that means it falls through the wedge in June or July, which is exactly what happened over here, right? It fell through the wedge in July and August, and ETH Bitcoin bottomed in September. So what happens is maybe this time it falls through the wedge in May or June, and then ETH Bitcoin bottoms in July or August, right? Or something like, you kind of understand like the sort of the path though. I think that this is playing out again, is my guess, on a much larger scale. But again, the rate hiking cycle was on a much larger scale. If you struggle with this idea because ETH USD has gone up so much that it couldn't possibly go back down, I would sort of retort and say, well, if it is strong on its own accord, why does it keep bleeding to Bitcoin? So the issue here for Ethereum, and I've said this many, many times, is that at some point in the future, Bitcoin's going to roll over and start putting in lower highs, okay? I don't know exactly when that's going to be. I've suggested that Bitcoin could find a local top sometime in the first half of this year. I think April is a good candidate. We saw last year, April, Bitcoin found a local top. It swept the high in June. 2021, it found a local top in April, swept the high in November. 2013, it found a local high in April, swept, went well above the highs in Q4. So I do think April is sort of a relevant time period to sort of consider here. And so if Bitcoin does find a local top in April going into the halving, and if it breaks ETH off of its Bitcoin support level during that process, and then Bitcoin rolls over exactly how it did in 2019 when rate cuts arrived, the problem for Ethereum at that point, and why I think it could break through that wedge again to the downside, is because it no longer has anywhere to hide on its Bitcoin pair. Throughout this entire process, we've seen all sorts of sort of predictions of why ETH Bitcoin is quote unquote holding up well. Again, no, dropping 40% against something that's less risky is not holding up well. And maybe what it's going to take to sort of do away with that view is for it to finally break down to 0.03 to 0.04. If it goes to 0.035, I don't know how anyone's going to say it's holding up well at that point. Because if it goes to 0.03 to 0.04, let's say it goes to, take it from the actual high, right? Right now from the actual high, it's down 42.5%. If it were to go down to 0.035, that's a 60% drop. That seems okay. So what? It seems possible that could happen. And it doesn't necessarily have any long-term implications for Ethereum. It's just that's what it does during a rate hiking cycle and late business cycle environment, is that it drops against lower risk assets like Bitcoin. It drops. And so what I wonder is, are you going to have a scenario where it breaks down and then people finally give up on it? The people that I've been arguing with for the last 2 years, they finally give up on it because it's finally breaking this support. And when they see 0.03 or 0.04, they're going to freak out because they haven't seen that. A lot of people joined crypto over here. They never saw ETH Bitcoin down over here, right? They never saw that. There is a different sort of breed of crypto investors interested in crypto over here than the people who joined over here. Okay, so if it comes back down here, then the question ultimately becomes, will those people capitulate? And if they do, it could be very quickly, and it could take only a couple of months. From the breakdown point here, ETH Bitcoin fell about 50%. From the breakdown point here, it fell about 40%. From the breakdown point here, maybe it falls 30%, right? If it does, that puts it at 0.035, right? I've said between 0.03 to 0.04 forever. It's been a long road. It's been a long road down, but it seems like it's playing out. So, well, that's up for debate. I mean, I think it certainly seems like the ETH Bitcoin aspect of it is playing out. ETH USD has been more resilient than I thought it was going to be, and I fully admit that. I take ownership for it. I'm not trying to skirt around that. You know, last video when ETH was at like 2,800, I talked about, you know, it seemed like it was following this pattern, and if it follows it, you could see it sort of push a lot higher up into the high 3,000s, maybe even go to 4K. And here we are. And the reality, though, is that if Bitcoin does push up in April again, then it could take ETH higher again, right? I don't know. Again, I think there's compelling views both ways. If you think about, you know, why I think Bitcoin could rally into the halving is because it rallied into the spot ETF, right? So that's another reason why it could rally into the halving. It also hasn't broken alts off their support levels yet. And we know that last cycle, Bitcoin rallied until alt Bitcoin pairs broke down, and it rallied until ETH Bitcoin broke down. Well, Bitcoin topped on a Bitcoin US, or ETH Bitcoin broke down on a Bitcoin USD lower high. But that's sort of the evidence to suggest that Bitcoin could go higher into the halving is that alt Bitcoin pairs has still not broken down, and ETH Bitcoin has still not broken down. The counterpoint, though, is we know that when we went into the merge, ETH USD actually topped out about 1 month before the merge, right? If you look at the merge here, it topped out in August, and then it was a lower high in September during the merge. So I don't want to completely dismiss the idea of a lower high by Bitcoin USD, but if it does put in a higher high, I want you to take a look at one really interesting pattern here. If it does put in a higher high, let's suppose that, you know, we just had, and it's really hard to say, right? I mean, there's certainly two different ways that you could look at this. You know, you see this move from the wedge here. It came up, pull back, and then blow off top into the, you know, a month before the first rate cut. Same kind of thing, right? I just don't know if we should look at it like this, like 1, 2, 3, where it already had that pullback and the blow off top has already occurred, right? Or if you look at it like, you know, this entire move is just one move, and then this is the pullback, and then you get one more push into the high. I mean, in fact, if you take a price percent here from that low to the actual top, it was another 58% rally. The funny thing is, from that low, 58% up is actually right at the prior all-time high. Isn't that a coincidence, right? It would be right at the prior all-time high for Ethereum. You know, also what's interesting is if that were to occur, and if Bitcoin did rally into, you know, sort of the halving, we are only about 20% away from total market cap getting back to its previous high. But the main difference between total market cap getting to its high here in November of 2021 and where it is right now, the main difference is that Bitcoin takes up much more market share now than it ever did back then, right? So, or during that rally, right? I mean, look at this. Look at where Bitcoin dominance was. It was at 43%. Now, Bitcoin dominance is at 53%. So it's 10% higher, but total market cap is the same. That's the same thing that happened over here in the 2019 rally, right? I mean, total market cap, I mean, it didn't put in a new high, but the qualitative view of it is the same, right? Not quantitative, but the qualitative pattern is the same, where total market cap went up a lot, and the main thing that changed was that Bitcoin dominance, you know, the last time it had been at that level, it was at, coincidentally, about 42, 43%, and then by the time Bitcoin USD topped out, it was at around 60%. Right there. So I can't help but think that ETH USD will follow what it did last cycle. I don't know if it's going to go higher or not. I don't know if it's going to go up to the prior high or not. I would say this. If ETH USD goes to the prior high, it's only because Bitcoin is at like 80K or something. It's not, I don't see ETH going to the prior high and Bitcoin staying at 70K. That's sort of the reality. And so if you believe that, right, if you think that that view is correct, that ETH Bitcoin is in the process of breaking down and that ETH USD is following that same pattern from last cycle, then I keep going back to this idea, well, like, why not just hold Bitcoin over Ethereum until a few months after ETH Bitcoin breaks down? To me, that has seemed like the obvious solution for the last 2 years. A lot of people have fought it, and I've sort of learned that no matter how many lower highs get put in, people are going to believe whatever they want to believe. But that's a long way down by ETH Bitcoin. And I'm suggesting that while it is 45% down, I think it's possible it could go a little bit further down. Now, just because ETH Bitcoin bottoms doesn't mean ETH USD initially, finds a low right then either. I mean, it could certainly go into a bit of a downtrend if the market does cool off into the summer. But I did just want to highlight this pattern. We showed this pattern back over here. We've seen, I mean, this was back when ETH was at 2,800. We've seen it since 2,800. We saw it rally all the way up to 4,000. I don't know if the top is in for it already or if it gets one last push, but that's where I am on it. I think either this is the top or you get one more push by it, and then you see it. But because I think ETH Bitcoin is really close to breaking down, then I would think that whenever that happens, ETH USD drops. The last two times that ETH Bitcoin broke down, ETH USD dropped, right? I mean, the last couple of times. And so I don't think this time will be different. I think it will be more or less the same, where whenever, I don't know when, but whenever ETH Bitcoin breaks support, ETH USD gets a large correction. I mean, you can see it pretty clearly in both of these prior cycles, right? I mean, right here, once ETH Bitcoin broke down, Ethereum dropped from from these highs, it had gone all the way up to $15, $16, and then it dropped about to $7, so about 50% drop. And then over here, when it broke down, it dropped from a little over $300 with a wick up to $360, all the way back down to around $100. It was like a 75% drop. Over here was about a 50% drop, I think. So I think that could still play out. I really do. And I think that, at this point, you either buy it or you don't. You either think it's right or not. And I think you could forgive people for having some skepticism, considering how much better Ethereum has done on its USD pair than I thought it was going to do. But my view on ETH Bitcoin has been correct. And I think that what has thrown me for a loop is sort of this reality that this rate hiking cycle was a lot more impressive than the one we saw last cycle, which is interesting because I kind of thought it was going to be. I mean, I said higher for longer. I was always in that camp. But I mean, it certainly seems like it could be playing out in a very similar fashion, just on a much grander scale. Right? So what I would look for is does ETH USD fall back through this wedge as the summer arrives, just like it did over here? That's what I would look at. A lot of people, I can't tell you how many people keep asking me to make like an accumulation phase of a lifetime video on Ethereum. Guys, I'm not going to promise anything like that. I will just say this, if you were me and you valued if you valued assets on their Bitcoin pairs, at what point in the last 2 years has ETH Bitcoin been at a point where today you can say, oh yeah, that was a good idea to YOLO in at that point? There hasn't been a time. I mean, ETH Bitcoin right now is sitting at 0.0507. In fact, if you look at weekly closes, there's only been 1 week where it had a close, I believe, lower than where it is now since this whole thing began. So in my mind, for those that want that video, the accumulation phase of a lifetime, right? if I'd made that video back over here or here, what justification would I tell you guys? Oh, God, you bought Ethereum. Oh, don't worry. It's down 50% against a lower risk asset like Bitcoin, but just believe me, no. For everyone that says ETH outperforms Bitcoin in a bull run, you're only right if you're assuming a QE bull run. If you're assuming a QT bull run, that's not true. ETH Bitcoin bled during the last Bitcoin QT bull run. During this bull run over here by Bitcoin USD in 2019, ETH Bitcoin went down while Bitcoin USD went up. Same thing here. Bitcoin USD up, ETH Bitcoin down. So you can't say it's going to outperform Bitcoin in a bull run. Yeah, maybe after rate cuts arrived and maybe after we see all the damage the Fed has done and then QE returns, then yeah, I would agree with you. It probably would outperform Bitcoin at that point, but only because it's been bleeding for it for the last 5 quarters in a row. So my guess, dubious speculation, of course, but my guess is that there is a chance that ETH Bitcoin bottoms in Q2. It might take until a little longer. It might take until Q3. I don't want to completely dismiss that idea. What I would say is after it breaks down, assuming that it does, I would say give it a few months. And then I think from that point, especially if you start to see those higher lows being set and rate cuts have arrived and even better if QE returns, then I think that would be the low for ETH Bitcoin. And I think it's going to be between 0.03 to 0.04. Okay. So that's my view on it. And, I know it's become somewhat of a meme at this point, and I kind of get it. I'm not trying to dispute it, honestly. But I did want to, sort of address what I previously spoken about, and that is the logarithmic regression band for Ethereum. So let me just go ahead and pull it back up, if I can find it. So here it is. And the general idea, right, after ETH Bitcoin broke down last cycle, right here, that is where ETH USD topped, right? ETH USD topped right there when ETH Bitcoin broke down, and then ETH USD went to the bottom of the regression band. So whenever ETH USD tops out, whether it already has or not, or it gets one more push into the Bitcoin halving, I don't know. Again, my view on it is that the only way ETH goes up to the prior high is if Bitcoin is much higher, right? I mean, if Bitcoin's at 80K, then ETH can go higher. But if Bitcoin only tops out at like 75K or 73K, if the top is already in, then that's it, right? I don't think ETH is going to go higher on its own. So at some point, whenever Ethereum sort of, assuming that it does, right? But whenever it fades back down, I do think there's a decent chance it's going to go back down to the regression band. Now, the regression band is much higher than it was back over here. So back over here in 2022, it was at 400, and then here it was at 500. So it obviously is a lot higher today than it was back then. But assuming Bitcoin cools off into the summer, and assuming that ETH Bitcoin has broken down, then why would we assume that this can't happen, right? Why would we assume that it can't happen? And if you think about Bitcoin USD, and you look at say like the risk metric for Bitcoin USD, again, we've hit the 0.7 to 0.8 risk band for a while here, and a lot of times within about 3 to 4 months or so after that, you find yourself back at the 0.3 to 0.4 risk band. Again, that doesn't mean Bitcoin can't go higher first. Sometimes it goes into higher risk bands as well, as you can see. But if that is the case, right, if Bitcoin does get a pullback into the summer after rate cuts sort of roll in, then what are the chances that ETH USD also gets a pullback? Probably pretty high. And if ETH Bitcoin has broken down already, then unfortunately for ETH, there's nowhere to hide. And that's when I think it could theoretically break through this wedge, and then come back down to the lower logarithmic regression band. I know I'm pretty stubborn on this, and I think you can probably forgive people that have had have sort of mocked this view that it will eventually do that after ETH Bitcoin breaks down. And I could be wrong. I get things wrong all the time. I'm just doing the best I can. In future cycles, I'm probably not going to be as opinionated, because even when I get things right, like the ETH Bitcoin valuation dropping 40%. The problem is that nobody cares because ETH USD is up, and if on the chance that I'm right and ETH USD does fall back through this wedge and come and go to the lower regression band, I don't even know that it would have been worth it waiting, a year and a half for it to occur, right? So I don't think next cycle I will be as opinionated about this stuff. I think I'll just kind of take a back seat and let the degen, so to speak. But I think one thing I've learned is that, it's not always about, sometimes it's more important to, I'm trying to think of the way to phrase it. Being right is not everything, right? And I certainly don't even get everything right. But even being right about certain things doesn't necessarily mean everything, right? Being right about ETH Bitcoin dropping 40% doesn't even necessarily matter, right? And if I'm right and it goes to 0.03 to 0.04, I don't know, who cares? It doesn't mean that anyone who just DCA'd it back over here is necessarily hurting. I still think they would have been better off just buying Bitcoin instead of buying Ethereum, right? But I don't think they're going to shed a tear because ETH is only up, a lower multiple than Bitcoin. They still made money on it, right? So sort of a lesson learned by me, being right. First of all, being right is something that only occurs, a certain portion of the time. When you're wrong, people definitely don't let you forget it. But even when you're right, it still doesn't necessarily mean everything, is the point, right? I can understand why, if you are an ETH maxi, why just DCAing it and sort of tuning out the Bitcoin valuation is a better strategy for you than waiting for some type of future collapse that may or may not even happen. That's what I want to say, right? So again, I don't think that being right is everything. And that's kind of something I've learned a lot. And that's coming from someone who, again, I have a track record of being right about certain things, being wrong about other things. I've learned that, when you're wrong, they never let you forget it. And even when you're right, it still doesn't always matter, okay? So just take that for what it's worth, especially if you're a person who wants to go on YouTube and make your own content. Try not to focus on that as much if you can, and focus on other things. I think that's what I'll try to do differently next cycle. Is that. But again, we'll see. We'll see if this plays out the same way, where it sort of falls back through here on rate cuts. And if it does, then if it comes back down here and the ETH Bitcoin valuation, is at 0.03 to 0.04, then I think you start to make the case that it could have bottomed out and that it could start trending higher. If you look actually at ETH Bitcoin, you see this logarithmic regression trend line for ETH USD. You see how it kind of just returns to it every so often. We haven't hit it yet, but I would say one interesting thing about it is that ETH Bitcoin is arguably following a very similar trend, right? I haven't fit it or anything, but you can imagine what it would look like, right? And if I were just to find this sort of the R or the curve function, again, this is not perfect, right? But you can kind of see the same pattern, right, that you saw for ETH USD. You can see the same pattern for ETH Bitcoin. So I think the issue is that whether you think that this is going to break to new highs eventually or come back down to 0.02, I would argue that wherever it goes, it first goes to 0.03 to 0.04. And then from there, we figure out if it's either going to go up or down. My guess is after it goes to 0.03 to 0.04 and spends a while there, it'll have enough fuel to then go back up for a while. But that is my current view. And I think you can kind of see how, in the same way that ETH USD could fall back into these levels, I think that ETH Bitcoin could fall back into the logarithmic regression trend line. But it's taking a very long period of time, arguably because this cycle has been just shifted out in terms of everything happening about 3 quarters later. If you think about when Bitcoin USD topped in 2019, it was the summer of 2019. If we do get a local top in April, it's about 3 quarters later. alt Bitcoin pairs broke down over here in June 2019. Again, April will be about 3 quarters later. The merge happened about 3 quarters after Bitcoin USD topped. Just seems like a lot of things have been shifted by about 9 or 10 months. And so what happens if ETH Bitcoin finally breaks down within the next month or two? When it does, that marks the top for ETH USD if it's not already in. Because the issue I think that I'm having right now is that it basically ETH Bitcoin is already at the range low. So what happens if it just slowly bleeds below 0.049 and ETH USD is still at 3,600 or 3,500 or wherever it is right now, right? 34.89. So either it needs to get a bounce and kick the can down the road another month or two, or it runs the risk of just capitulating into April really soon, and then maybe bottoming out sometime, Q2 or Q3. The other way to look at Ethereum is to potentially look at like the risk metric. So the risk metric on ETH right now is currently 0.704. So it is pretty elevated. It looks like it has gone all the way up to 0.752 risk at this point. So it has gone up a lot. And we also have this asset filter over here. We can filter it by Ethereum and look at a lot of the different charts for Ethereum. We can look at the running 1-year ROI if you're curious about that. You can almost draw sort of an imaginary trend line through here if you wanted to look at the ROI after the cycle low for Ethereum. You can actually see that it's right where it was at this point last cycle. And if you take it from May, right? I mean, look where it is. It's still doing exactly what it did. I mean, that honestly, like that is probably some of the biggest counter evidence to sort of the view that I presented. The other view, though, is that while it is tracking it, if you look at sort of the last 2 cycles, at some point, they just sort of deviated. They didn't track it forever. And so we know that diminishing returns is a thing. And so if that is the case, and we do get diminishing returns, and if it sort of falls back down, you could still have another rally later on, but it, maybe doesn't peak until much further out. But yeah, I thought this was interesting. And again, so one thing to sort of keep in mind, again, I'm not asking you to care about, these other, necessarily any of these other altcoins, but one thing to consider is that, a lot of times I'll look at this stuff and it seems like it's going to follow the path, and then it doesn't, right? I mean, like look at XRP. I mean, again, this is something that, again, I haven't bought XRP in forever, but not too long ago, a lot of people were sort of looking at this chart or a similar type of chart, maybe not this one specifically, and saying, well, this is when it's going to bounce, and it just never did. And you could look at Cardano and say sort of similar things, right? Like, it was tracking the prior cycle at one point, and then it really just kind of fell off, right? So I wouldn't look at this and assume that it has to follow it. But again, I don't want to, I don't just want it to be an echo chamber. I know it's kind of does devolve into that sometimes, but this has some counter evidence, okay? There's no such thing as a sure thing. My view could be wrong, and if it is wrong, it's probably because it's following this path as opposed to the path that I presented. So I would keep an eye on that as well for Ethereum. Does it continue to follow that? I mean, it has already deviated at points, so I don't really know why it couldn't deviate again, but that is something to think about. And the other way to look at it is through the peak. So if you look at it through the peak, and you take it out to the next peak, you can see we are so far ahead of where we were at this point in the prior cycle. At this point in the prior cycle, ETH was still down 84% from its high. 84% from its high at this point in the last cycle. I mean, again, I'm not saying that ETH has to go down 84% from its high, but just to give you an idea of like what that means, like how bad it was back then, that would put ETH at $762. But that's just where it was. There is diminishing volatility from one cycle to another. Diminishing losses, just like diminishing returns. But that's how far down it was last cycle. One of my favorite charts recently, maybe a bit of a coping chart, ETH USD denominated in chocolate, cocoa. It's actually below the 2022 low. Sometimes you really have to ask yourself is, are asset prices going up because anything is fundamentally changed, or are they just going up because of all the money printing and everything's going up? You know, if everything is going up, that's, you know, where inflation comes from. So like, while asset prices might seem like they've gone up, they haven't when you factor in inflation. So when you look at something like Ethereum valued on some commodity that's been going parabolic, it doesn't really look as impressive. And for me, like, this is what would have made more sense, honestly. But crypto is very volatile, right? It's very volatile. It often goes undervalued more than it should, and then goes overvalued more than it should. It just oscillates a lot in one direction or the other. Even last cycle, going into rate hikes, you know, or the pause, ETH rallied 300%, and then it fell 75%. Or sorry, this is valued in cocoa. But again, like it wouldn't be much different because I don't imagine it was. So you can see it rallied about 350%, and then it fell 75%. If you look over here at ETH/USD, it has rallied, coincidentally, 360% or so. I mean, not that different from what it did over there. I'm not saying it has to fall 75%, and that was from a black swan, but, you know, even if it fell 60%, that puts it at 1,600. 70% would put it at 1,200. 75% would put it back near the range lows. But again, I mean, that doesn't have to happen immediately. There's even some cases to be made that it could take a lot longer to play out. That might, you know, maybe the best example would be looking at something like the .com era, where you had things like, you know, not Costco, Cisco, you know, put in a low in a midterm year, and then it actually took that low out 4 years later, right? So, I mean, I really hope that does not happen in the cryptoverse, right? I would much prefer something like what we got last cycle, where, you know, you basically just get a sort of mid-cycle top, and then the market cools off for like 6 to 9 months, and then we get another rally in 2025. That is what I would prefer. But if I'm wrong, if my views are wrong, which is entirely possible, and if ETH rallies, you know, beyond, you know, well beyond the prior highs, or even well beyond where it is, like, I don't want to say it can't go higher. If Bitcoin goes up, it will take ETH with it, more than likely. But if ETH rallies like way above the prior highs, and I'm just wrong, flat out wrong, on the ETH Bitcoin pair, like if ETH Bitcoin gets some massive bounce and ETH starts to outperform, I don't know what the narrative would be that people would follow. Maybe the spot ETF for ETH gets approved or something. I don't know. Then I imagine you would just want to follow sort of the prior path, and just, you know, without the sort of the catastrophe in between. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see how it plays out here. If it does just continue to mimic sort of a bigger version of this, or if it does something completely different. Because, like, the thing about this one is that I know a lot of people give me, you know, they don't like the fact that I compare it to 2019 because it's gone up, because it's been taking a lot longer. But still, because ETH Bitcoin continues to drop, and because the Fed has not yet pivoted, why would we assume that it's not following the same thing? Because nothing has changed, right? It's still bleeding against Bitcoin. The Fed has not yet cut rates. And that was the turning point for it at the mid-cycle top last cycle. And by the way, if you have a hard time with that, you know, like sort of a 6 to 9 month lull in the market, what's fascinating is that everything's been shifted by about 3 quarters. What if you shift this again, you go 3 quarters out, you get to the end of the year, and then QE returns and you get another bull market, right? I mean, maybe that top plays out. But anyways, those are my views. I wanted to express those. I want to talk about Ethereum. It has been a while, so I did want to at least talk a little bit about some of the different things for Ethereum. There's not a whole lot of other things to really look at. I mean, we got a ton of charts on here if you guys want to go check it out, intothecryptoverse.com. We have the sale still going. We're actually going to raise prices on after the Bitcoin halving, so you can lock in the lower rate if you want. In addition, we do have the sale right now, so we're going to go up a good amount actually after the halving, but for new people, not for existing. So check it out, intothecryptoverse.com. You have an asset filter. You can really enter a lot of these different assets and find all the charts we have on them, and then hopefully use those charts to make your own conclusions. If you're curious about what this sort of looks like, this is the percent drawdown from the all-time high. We've got a lot of different things on here. Here's an interesting one. Days since ETH has dropped 30%, 504 days. Days since it's dropped 50%, 648 days. And no wonder it feels like no one thinks it can actually ever go down again, because it's been 648 days since I had a 50% drop. But anyways, I think we'll wrap it up there. You guys know my general views on the market. Bitcoin, I do think, is going to take dominance. I think Bitcoin dominance is going to 56% really soon, and then I think 60% shortly thereafter. ETH dominance is currently at 16.65%. So if it breaks below here, I would watch out below because things can move quickly. So do keep an eye on that, especially as ETH Bitcoin is fading into the lows here. As we get into April, Bitcoin halving, it just seems like there's going to be a great chance that ETH Bitcoin breaks down and that this whole narrative we've been following finally plays out. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.